There have been lots of stories over the past few months on identity theft and how the information can be used against you. You may have heard something about stolen identity tax fraud. You may even have been a victim of it. It's the biggest tax scam around right now. As we first reported in September, this is how it works. Someone steals your identity, files a bogus tax return in your name before you do, and collects a refund from the IRS. It's so simple you would think it would never work, but it does. It's been around since 2008. You'd think the IRS would have come up with a way to stop it. It hasn't. Instead, the scam's gone viral, tripling in the last 3 years. The government says it's affecting millions of Americans and costing taxpayers billions of dollars every year, proving once again what every good con man already knows. There is no underestimating the general dysfunction and incompetence of government bureaucracy.
It's a tsunami of fraud that we have been encountering. The vast number of fraudulent tax returns was something that I don't think the IRS ever really was ready for.
Wilfredo Ferrer is the United States Attorney for Southern Florida, and George Pirro, the agent in charge of the Miami field office of the FBI. Together, they run a federal task force operating at the epicenter of the largest tax scam in the country.
Florida has been third year in a row on the top, #1, in terms of ID theft complaints. And Miami is also #1 in terms of metropolitan areas that suffer from identity fraud.
Don't take this the wrong way. Is there any scheme that Miami is not #1 at?
We have very sophisticated and good criminals, Steve, who know how to defeat the system.
For decades now, South Florida has been the Silicon Valley for scam artists, drawn here by the weather, the beaches, and the opportunity to make lots of money without actually doing much work. There's Medicare fraud, mortgage fraud, securities fraud, and now what the Justice Department calls stolen identity tax refund fraud, a tax preparation scheme epitomized by an overabundance of questionable-looking establishments that have sprung up here over the past few years. But this scam is so easy you don't even need an office.
For this fraud, all you need is a laptop, someone's social security number, date of birth, not even their name. They can do it from their kitchen table, they can do it at a fast food chain restaurant, or they can do it on the beach as long as they have Wi-Fi access.
Actually, Corey Williams says you don't even need a laptop. You can file phony returns on your cell phone if you have the right app. He used to be a legitimate tax preparer until his boss turned him onto the scam. Before he was arrested and sentenced to 40 months in prison, he'd made millions and millions of dollars.
Anybody who knew about it, you'd be a fool to not try to get involved with making some money. I could wake up in the comfort of my own home and just get on a laptop, do about 15 returns a day. 15 times $3,000 a return, that's $45,000 a day.
So you had a home office?
Yeah, I used to work I would work in my boxes and a t-shirt. Yeah.
It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. Williams gave us a demonstration. 1, you collect or buy a list of stolen identities that are readily available in Miami if you know the right people. 2, you go to one of dozens of tax preparation sites online, and using the stolen Social Security numbers and dates of birth, you fill out a completely bogus W-2 form claiming a modest refund of a few $1,000s.
It has given us a refund of $4,834.
3, you tell the IRS if you want the refund mailed to your house, wired to your bank account, or loaded onto a prepaid debit card.
You have any idea how many bogus returns you filled out?
It has to be like in the thousands.
Did the IRS pay all of them?
On a percentage range, you'd say they would pay out 40% of the tax returns.
Once you hit the send button, how long did it take you to get a check?
7 days.
7 days?
Yes.
So you'd send in these returns, and 7 days later, you'd get a check?
Yes.
40% of the time?
40% of the time.
Where would you have them send the check?
You could send the checks to an address, any address. I've seen cases where 25 checks came to one address, and the mailman delivered it.
It sounded so outrageous, we wanted to run it by the federal task force.
So you just put down a name and a social security number, and you could make up an employer or the amount of money that was earned and withheld, and send it off to the IRS, and they'll send you a check back for the refund?
They will pay most of the time unless they catch that there's some fraudulent, information, and then it's our job to chase.
I'm still amazed that you don't need to provide any documentation when you file your tax return.
There are no supporting documents when you're filing electronically. And that's the ease or the convenience that was created for the benefit of the innocent taxpayer, which is now being exploited by criminals.
You would think that the IRS computers would notice that they were sending thousands of checks to a handful of addresses, but they didn't. And you might expect that the IRS would match taxpayer returns with legitimate W-2 forms filed by employers. It doesn't do that either because the law requires refund checks to be sent out within 6 weeks, and employer W-2s are often not available until months later. So if a bogus return is received before a legitimate one, the check will go out to the crooks.
The way that you learn that you become a victim of this is when you go in and try to file your return and the IRS tells you, oh, you've already filed. You're like, no, I haven't. Oh, like, yes, you have. Well, it wasn't you. It was the fraudster who used your identity to file the return.
And it's not an easy problem to get fixed. Many of the people in this line outside the IRS office in Plantation, Florida, are victims of the fraud, waiting to prove their identity and claim their rightful refund. They will eventually be reimbursed, but it can involve massive amounts of paperwork, multiple visits to the office, and months of waiting.
Did you know about this before you got this job?
I had no idea about this before I started getting briefed last fall.
John Koskinen is the commissioner of the IRS, its fourth commissioner in just 2 years. It's become a high turnover position in part because the agency has been beset by a number of embarrassing problems, including stolen identity tax fraud, that have led people to question its competency.
I mean, it looks to me like the IRS got really outsmarted by some people who were not all that bright or not all that ingenious.
What happened was a lot of people discovered that A, Social Security numbers are either easy to steal or find or buy, and then B, you could file a false return.
Why didn't anybody anticipate that?
Well, I think it goes back to the fact that people didn't anticipate Social Security numbers were going to be so readily available. The assumption was, until very recently, that a Social Security number was part of your identity that you protected and took great care of, so that no one actually ever expected that those would be easy to get a hold of.
But there were plenty of warnings. The Senate Finance Committee held hearings on stolen identity refund fraud way back in 2009, when then IRS Commissioner Douglas Shulman testified.
I discussed the issue of identity theft with the senior leaders at the IRS my first day on the job.
There were more hearings in 2011 and another in 2012 with Deputy IRS Commissioner Steve Miller.
We cannot stop all identity theft. However, we are better than we were, and we will get better still.
In those ensuing years, the number of cases of stolen identity refund fraud have risen from 51,000 to nearly 3 million.
In the year 2012, the Department of Treasury's Inspector General predicted that by the year 2016, IRS will be hemorrhaging and losing $21 billion due to this type of fraud.
It's only 2014. Don't you think something can be done in the next 2 years to fix this?
Well, that is my hope.
But it will not be easy. The entire IRS system uses Social Security numbers as its primary means of identifying taxpayers, even though they're now ubiquitous in public, private, and corporate files, just waiting to be stolen by thieves.
The key to this is to have somebody in the inside or someone who has access to our Social Security numbers, to our date of birth, and a lot of these individuals are insiders in big institutions, in banks, hospitals, schools, clinics.
We would approach anyone who worked at like a dental office, anybody who worked in the medical field. You would just approach them, you tell them if they get you 100 names, you would give them $1,000.
These people easy to find in Miami?
Very easy, very easy.
Because you would think if you went in and started knocking doors and asking people that worked at hospitals and doctors' offices and dentists' offices, somebody would call the cops.
No, they needed the money more than they wanted to call the cops. Everybody was with it. Everybody was with the scam.
Was this like a community of people doing this?
More like a nation of people doing this.
It's gone from hundreds of people filing hundreds of fraudulent returns to thousands of people filing millions of fraudulent returns. And it's become much more organized. U.S. Attorney Ferrer says some people are even setting up franchises.
We have had defendants, masterminds of these schemes, engage in filing parties. And what they do is that they invite their friends to a hotel room or to an apartment, and then they tell them how to do it in return for a cut of these tax returns.
You make it sound like Amway or Tupperware.
That's what we've seen.
Even Ferrer's old boss, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, had his identity stolen in an IRS refund scam. And a number of members of the task force have also been victimized, including North Miami Beach police officer Rocky Festa, who says local police departments have been hit hard.
Aventura had nearly the entire department, which was 50-some-odd officers got hit. Davie Fire and Davie Police, it was in the hundreds. They were all victims of tax return fraud.
Festa and his partner, Craig Caitlin, now work exclusively on tax refund cases and were among the first to discover the breadth of the scam 5 years ago when they began finding tax documents and stacks of prepaid debit cards when they pulled over suspicious vehicles.
Here's a wire plastic with the card.
You can get one of these prepaid debit cards almost anywhere, usually without providing identification. You then deposit and withdraw money from it as needed. It's like a bank account for people who don't have one.
Now, is that a Visa, real Visa card?
It's a real Visa card. And you can
So you can go into a convenience store and buy a Visa card?
right off the shelf.
If you want, the IRS will electronically deposit tax refunds directly onto these cards, no questions asked, eliminating the need for crooks to ever actually set foot inside a bank or to try and cash a refund check. They can spend the money in stores or withdraw it from ATMs.
So is this kind of like a throwaway phone?
Yes, sir. Yeah, once the money goes on the card, you empty the money off on ATMs and you put the card in the garbage. It's pretty good.
The prepaid cards are now used by millions of Americans to collect $142 billion in government entitlements, like Social Security and Medicare payments. IRS Commissioner Koskinen thinks it's an invitation to commit fraud.
The prepaid cards are the currency of criminals. Our problem is you can't distinguish the number of a prepaid card from a legitimate bank account.
Almost impossible to trace, right?
It is almost impossible to trace.
Why doesn't somebody put an end to that?
There are a significant percentage of the population unbanked, as it were called. Because if you don't allow them to use a prepaid card, they're going to have to get a check, and they'll have to pay somebody a lot of money to cash that check. So you're disadvantaging a significant part of the population.
And empowering a criminal network.
And you're empowering a criminal network.
5 years into the scam, the IRS can still not always tell if the person filing the return and claiming the refund is actually the real taxpayer. By comparison, the credit card companies are much better at flagging suspicious charges before they're paid out.
Credit card companies don't have that much of a problem with this. Why can't the IRS do that?
So that's the direction in which we're going. It's a significant move into what I call the 21st century. We're still kind of in the late 1900s, but this is still a big problem that while we're making great progress, we've got a lot of work to do.
And they're having trouble keeping up with the con artists. Last month, the IRS announced that hackers had busted into its computer system and stolen another 104,000 taxpayer identities, which so far have been used to collect nearly $50 million in bogus refunds. As for Corey Williams, he's now in jail, serving his 40-month sentence.